So far, we've talked about problems with the dominant story of business. And we've outlined a number of ways to think about business as set in society, some new models of business in society, based on corporate philanthropy, based on corporate social responsibility, and based on multiple ways of understanding the environment. What I'd like to do now is put these in perspective and suggest there's a more comprehensive way to reorient the dominant story of business. And this depends on the emergence of the idea of stakeholders. Now, most of you have probably heard of the idea of stakeholders, but I can tell you 30 years ago, almost no one had heard of the idea. It really grew out of people thinking about business strategy. And as the business environment began to change and get more global, and people began to be aware of things outside of their companies, there needed to be a way to organize this thinking. And so a group of people at the Stanford Research Institute in the 1960s came up with this idea of, well, let's organize it by customers, suppliers, employees, communities, and financiers, the people with the money. And let's call those groups stakeholders. A second thing happened in the Scandinavian countries, primarily in Sweden. A thinker named Eric Renman began to be worried about not only the environment and how changes in the environment changed what you needed to do in a company, but also began to be worried about the role of employees and the whole movement in the Scandinavian countries of industrial democracy. And so from this came the idea that businesses needed to pay attention to its stakeholders. Now, there are lots of reasons for this. You can think businesses need to pay attention to stakeholders because it's the right thing to do, and I think it is. You can think business needs to pay attention to its stakeholders because it's the smart thing to do, and it is. I think that's right. Or you might have some other reason. It doesn't depend on a particular political ideology one way or the other. What's important here is that what I've called stakeholder theory comes from what companies actually do. This is not some theoretical exercise. I developed a lot of the ideas based on my own observations in the late 1970s and 80s on how companies dealt with their stakeholders. I defined stakeholder as any group or individual who can affect or be affected by the achievement of a company's purpose. Now, sometimes it's useful to think very broadly, so that NGOs, interest groups, governments, media, even competitors are stakeholders. And sometimes it's useful to think more narrowly, to think about really just customers, suppliers, employees, communities, and financiers. How you define stakeholders depends in part on what you're trying to do. If you want to get a broad scan of who can affect you, you need to think broadly. If you want a more narrow idea, then you need to think more narrowly. A picture might be helpful here. We could think about, put the firm in the middle, and think about customers, communities, employees, suppliers, and the people with the money, financiers, right? And then we might think about those groups that can affect these: NGOs, governments, the media, competitors, and let's just say others. Every company has a picture roughly like this. I'd like to play you a short clip of an interview that I did about what is stakeholder theory. Stakeholder theory is an idea about how business really works. It says that for any business to be successful, it has to create value for customers, suppliers, employees, communities, and financiers, shareholders, banks, and others, the people with the money. It says that you can't look at any one of those stakes, or stakeholders, if you like, in isolation. Their interest has to go together, and the job of a manager or an entrepreneur is to figure out how the interest of customers, suppliers, communities, employees, and financiers go in the same direction. Now, think about how important each of these groups is for a business to be successful. Think about a business that's lost its edge with its customers, that has products and services that its customers don't want as much, or that they don't want at all. That's a business in decline. Think about a business who manages suppliers in a way that the suppliers don't make them better. The suppliers just take orders and sell stuff, but the suppliers aren't trying to make a business more innovative, more creative. That's a business that's in a holding pattern and probably in decline. Think about a business whose employees don't want to be there every day, who aren't using 100% of their effort and their energy and their creativity to make the business better. That's a business in decline. Think about a business that's not a good citizen in the community, that routinely ignores or violates local custom and law, that doesn't pay attention to the quality of life in the community, doesn't pay attention to issues of corporate responsibility, of sustainability, of its effects on civil society. That's a business that's soon to be regulated into decline. And think about a business that doesn't create value, doesn't create profits for its financiers, its shareholders, banks, and others. That's a business in decline. So stakeholder theory is the idea that each one of these groups is important to the success of a business, and figuring out where their interests go in the same direction is what the managerial task and the entrepreneurial task is all about. Stakeholder theory says if you just focus on financiers, you miss what makes capitalism tick. What makes capitalism tick is that shareholders and financiers, customers, suppliers, employees, communities can together create something that no one of them can create alone. So there's some basic ideas here. All businesses create or sometimes destroy value for its stakeholders. And knowing how that value is created and what it is turns out to be important. I don't mean just financial value. The second principle is successful companies constantly look for the intersection of stakeholder interest. I remember a conversation with a fast-moving consumer goods company in Europe who was very near to bankruptcy. And they asked me, they said, look, in our situation, we're really hurting. Why should we worry about stakeholders? Should we worry about them? And I said, well, look, of course you have to. You haven't done a very good job with customers, with your suppliers, with your employees. You haven't found the sweet spot, the intersection of those interests. And you need to rethink your business model. How you create value for stakeholders is in effect what your business model turns out to be. The stakeholder idea sets this firmly in society. Now, of course, you can also think about the stakeholder idea personally. So you could put yourself in here. Here, I'll just do one for me. I'll put Ed in here. And I'll think about my students as a stakeholder. I'll think about my family. I'll think about my colleagues. I'll think about the media, because I have to deal with them some. I'll think about the university. I'll think about other universities where I might go. I'll think about some businesses that I work with. And you could think about, in a sense, a personal stakeholder map. Now, what's important here is that I might have some purpose. In my case, it's to try and inspire my students. And I try to think about who can affect that. What I'd like you to do for an engagement question, and to talk about if you feel comfortable in the discussion forums, is to draw a stakeholder map for yourself. Who can affect or be affected by what you do? Do you have a purpose? You can answer this for an organization you belong to or just for yourself.